The Bougainville Campaign was a series of land and naval battles of the Pacific Campaign of World War II between Allied forces and the Empire of Japan. It was part of Operation Cartwheel, the Allied grand strategy in the South Pacific. The campaign took place in the Northern Solomons in two phases. The first phase, in which American troops invaded and held the perimeter around the beachhead at Torokina, lasted from November 1943 through November 1944. The second phase, in which primarily Australian troops went on the offensive, mopping up pockets of starving, isolated but still determined Japanese, lasted from November 1944 until August 1945, when the last Japanese on the island surrendered. Operations during the final phase of the campaign saw the Australian forces advance north towards the Bonas Peninsula and south towards the main Japanese stronghold around Buin. Although the war ended before these two enclaves were completely destroyed. Japanese occupation. Before the war, Bougainville had been administered as part of the Australian territory of New Guinea, even though, geographically, Bougainville is part of the Solomon Islands chain. As a result, within the various accounts of the campaign it is referred to as part of both the New Guinea and the Solomon Islands campaigns. During their occupation, the Japanese constructed naval aircraft bases in the north, east, and south of the island, but none in the west. They developed a naval anchorage at Tonelli Harbour near Buin, the largest base on the southern coastal plain of Bougainville. On the nearby Treasury and Shortland Islands they built airfields, naval bases and anchorages. These bases helped protect Rabaul, the major Japanese garrison and naval base in Papua New Guinea, while allowing continued expansion to the southeast, down the Solomon Islands chain, to Guadalcanal and New Guinea and beyond. To the Allies, Bougainville would later also be considered vital for neutralizing the Japanese base around Rabaul. In March to April 1942, the Japanese landed on Bougainville as part of their advance into the South Pacific. At the time, there was only a small Australian garrison on the island which consisted of about 20 soldiers from the 1st Independent Company and some coast watchers. Shortly after the Japanese arrived, the bulk of the Australian force was evacuated by the Allies, although some of the coast watchers remained behind to provide intelligence. Once secured, the Japanese began constructing a number of airfields across the island. The main airfields were on Buka Island, the Bonas Peninsula in the north, at Kahili and Kara in the south, and Kieta on the east coast, while a naval anchorage was constructed at Tonelli Harbour near Buin on the southern coastal plain, along with anchorages on the Shortland Islands group. The airfield at Kahili was known by the Japanese as Buin Airfield, and to its south was an airfield on Balal Island in the Shortland Islands. These bases allowed the Japanese to conduct operations in the southern Solomon Islands and to attack the Allied lines of communication between the United States, Australia and the Southwest Pacific area. At the opening of the Allied offensives, their estimates of Japanese strength on Bougainville varied widely, ranging between 45,000 and 65,000 Army, Navy, and labor personnel. These forces constituted the Japanese 17th Army, commanded by General Hirokichi Hyakutake. Hyakutake reported to General Hitoshi Imamura, commander of the Japanese 8th Area Army, headquartered at Rabaul on New Britain Island. Naval command at Rabaul was the responsibility of Vice Admiral Jinichi Kusaka, Commander Southeast Area Fleet. The level of cooperation between these two officers was greater than that usually found between the branches of the Japanese armed forces. On Bougainville, the Japanese forces consisted of the following formations: the 17th Infantry Group, consisting of the 81st Infantry Regiment and the 3-battalion 53rd Infantry Regiment under Major General Kesaukijima, and elements of the 6th Division. The 17th Infantry occupied northern Bougainville, while the 6th had responsibility for the island south of Torokina. Allied planning. Choice of Bougainville. Reduction of the main Japanese base at Rabaul was the ultimate goal of the Allied offensive in the Solomons. To achieve this, Allied planners formulated Operation Cartwheel. By 1943, Rabaul was already within range of Allied heavy bombers, but a closer airfield was needed for light bombers and escort fighters. Thus, the entire island of Bougainville did not need to be occupied. Only enough relatively flat land to support an air base was required. According to Morrison, this was the one and only reason why the JCS authorized Halsey to seize a section of Bougainville, to establish forward airfields for strikes on Rabaul. The area around Cape Torokina was settled on since, among other things, the Japanese were not there in force and had no airfield there. Also, Empress Augusta Bay had a somewhat protected anchorage, and the physical barriers to the east of the Cape, for instance the mountain ranges and thick jungle, meant that mounting a counterattack would be beyond the capabilities of the Japanese for weeks, if not months, which would allow the U.S. forces to consolidate after landing and give them enough time to establish a strong perimeter. Preparations for the landings. Bougainville lay within the Southwest Pacific area, so operations were nominally under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, whose headquarters were in Brisbane, Australia. Although MacArthur had to approve all major moves, he gave planning and operational control to Admiral William F. Halsey, Commander U.S. 3rd Fleet, headquartered at Noumea on New Caledonia. In mid-October, Halsey set the 1st of November as the date for the invasion of Bougainville. By early October, it was clear to the Japanese that the Allies were planning a follow-up offensive to the Allied capture of the New Georges. Although the target was uncertain, the commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, Admiral Mainichi Koga, flying his flag aboard the battleship Musashi from Truk Lagoon, ordered all of his carrier aircraft to Rabaul. These planes would combine with the land-based air force already there and bomb Allied bases and supply routes as part of a plan the Japanese call Operation Row. In the event, this plan achieved very little besides further attrition to the Japanese air arm, as the Japanese aircraft suffered heavy losses, which later prevented the Japanese aircraft from intervening against the U.S. landings in the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. To confuse the Japanese as to the Allies' real target, two other invasions were carried out. The Treasury Islands, a little to the southwest of the Shortlands, were occupied the 27th of October by the 8th Brigade Group, 3rd New Zealand Division under the command of Brigadier Robert Rowe, and a temporary landing was effected on Cartwheel, one of the major islands in the Solomons chain. Unlike on Guadalcanal and the New Georges, Allied planners were unable to gain valuable intelligence from coastwatches or small Australian Army detachments, as the Japanese had driven them off the island long before plans for Operation Cherry Blossom began. Forces allocated. Rear Admiral Theodore Wilkinson, Commander 3rd Fleet Amphibious Forces, was assigned by Halsey to direct the landings at Cape Torokina from aboard his flagship, the attack transport George Clymer. The ships under Wilkinson's command would disembark the 1st Marine Amphibious Corps under the command of Major General Alexander Vandergrift, victor of the land campaign on Guadalcanal. van der Grift's force, a total of 14,321 men, consisted of the 3rd Marine Division under Marge Gen. Alan H. Turnage, the 37th Infantry Division under Marge Gen. Robert S. Baitler, and the Advanced Naval Base Unit No. 7. Landings at Cape Torokina. First day, 1 to 2 November 1943. 3 groups of transports converged in Empress Augusta Bay on the morning of the 1st of November. The existing maps of the Bougainville coast that the Allies possessed were highly unreliable German Admiralty charts from about 1890. A few corrections had been made by reconnaissance flights and submarine scouting, but some longitudes were still wrong. Indeed, Morrison recounts that near the end of the approach, when the navigating officer of a transport was asked by the captain for his ship's position, he replied, "About 3 miles inland, sir." Morrison further recounts the scene of the landing in the following passage: "To the forces, as they approached, Empress Augusta Bay presented a magnificent but somewhat terrifying spectacle. Behind the curved sweep of the shoreline, a heavy, dark green jungle swept up over foothills and crumpled ridges to the Cordillera, which was crowned by a smoking volcano, Mount Baronga, 8,650 feet above sea level. It was wilder and more majestic scenery than anyone had yet witnessed in the South Pacific. For the difficult landings at Guadalcanal and the New Georges, Admiral Wilkinson had learned a significant lesson about the necessity of rapid unloading and getting his slow, vulnerable transports away from the landing area. To this end, he only loaded his transports half full and his cargo ships 1/4 full, and made sure that 30% of the troops on the beach assisted in unloading. The Japanese, having been taken by surprise, were unable to mount an air assault on the invasion fleet. Admiral Wilkinson, grateful that his transports were able to land almost the entire troop contingent and a large amount of materiel unmolested by air attack, ordered them out of the area around sundown. Japanese response. Japanese forces around the landing area were limited to no more than platoon strength, as they had not expected a landing in the area and the logistics system was unable to support greater numbers. When word of the landings reached Rabaul, Vice Admiral Tomoshi Gasamejima, commander Japanese 8th Fleet, immediately embarked 1,000 troops from the 2 Battalion, 54th Infantry Regiment onto 5 destroyer transports at Rabaul and sent them to Cape Torokina to effect a counter-landing. Escorting the transports was a force of 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers and 6 destroyers led by Vice Admiral Santaro Omori. During the night voyage to Torokina, the Japanese ships were spotted by an American submarine and possibly by a search plane. Concerned that he had lost the element of surprise, Omori radioed Samejima to ask permission to send the slow-moving transports back to Rabaul, but to continue with the combat ships to attack the American transports that he assumed were still in Empress Augusta Bay. Samejima concurred, and Omori pressed ahead with his cruisers and destroyers. At the same time, Rear Admiral Stanton Merrill was steaming toward the bay with 4 light cruisers and 8 destroyers. The 2 forces met in the early morning hours of the 2nd of November in the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay, in which the Japanese lost light cruiser Sendai and destroyer Hatsuka's carrier raid on Rabaul. Admiral Koga was unwilling to risk his precious aircraft carriers, but decided to dispatch 7 heavy cruisers to Rabaul. These arrived on the 3rd of November. News of the cruiser's arrival in the area of operations greatly concerned Admiral Halsey. The Bougainville beachhead was still quite vulnerable and he had no heavy cruisers at all to oppose a bombardment. Taking a huge gamble, he ordered the only carrier force under his immediate command, Task Force 38 under Rear Admiral Frederick C. Sherman, to cripple or sink as much of the combat shipping in Simpson Harbor as possible. The resulting airstrike, launched from Sherman's fleet carrier Saratoga and light carrier Princeton on the 5th of November, with fighter escorts being provided by land-based aircraft from Air Solomon's command and followed up by land-based aircraft from the 5th Air Force, sank no ships but inflicted enough damage to convince Koga to withdraw the heavy cruisers, without having been able to attack the beachhead. A second raid was launched on the 11th of November with aircraft from the Essex, Bunker Hill and Independence, along with a sizable force of land-based B-24 bombers. The use of land-based heavy bombers against the Japanese ships proved ineffective, but the carrier-based aircraft achieved a degree of success, sinking a destroyer and damaging 3 destroyers and 2 cruisers. November 1943, expanding the beachhead. Early November defense and expansion of the U.S. lodgment at Cape Torokina involved protracted and often bitter jungle warfare, with many casualties resulting from malaria and other tropical diseases. Except for patrol skirmishes, all of the major combat to expand the beachhead occurred in the marine sector. From 6 to the 19th of November, the remaining regiment of the 3rd Marine Division and the U.S. Army 37th Infantry Division were landed and the beachhead gradually expanded. On the third attempt, the Japanese successfully landed 4 destroyer loads of men just beyond the eastern limit of the American beachhead before dawn on the 7th of November. Despite the presence of U.S. PT boats operating out of Purita Island, the Japanese effected this landing completely undetected by the Americans. Nevertheless, the Marines annihilated this force the next day in the Battle of Torokina Lagoon. In conjunction with the landing forces, the Japanese 23rd Infantry Regiment, which was assigned to the 6th Division, also began attacking the U.S. forces, with some success on the 7th of November, before being beaten back the following day. While escorting one of the invasion echelons to the Torokina beachhead on the 9th of November, Morrison recounts that some of Admiral Merrill's sailors witnessed an extraordinary incident that highlighted some of the extreme cultural differences at play in the Pacific. On the way north, the Blue Jackets topside in destroyer Spence were goggle-eyed at an exhibition of Japanese Bushido. Ordered to investigate a life raft, they observed what appeared to be 7 bodies in it. The 7 bodies suddenly sat up and started talking. One of them, apparently the officer, broke out of 7.7-mm machine gun, which each man in succession placed in his mouth, while the officer fired a round which shot the back of the man's head off. After 6 had been bumped off, the officer stood up, addressed a short speech in Japanese to Spence's commanding officer on the bridge, and then shot himself. Parts of 2 Marine Raider battalions drove away Japanese who were blocking the Piva branch of the Numa Numa Trail in the 8–9 November battle for Piva Trail. The Marines then selected sites in the area for 2 airstrips. Also on the 9th of November, Major General Roy South Geiger, USMC, took over command of the 1st Marine Amphibious Corps from General Vandergrift. 4 days later, he assumed command of the entire Torokina beachhead area from Admiral Wilkinson. By this time, the perimeter, as it was called, covered about 7,000 yards of beachfront and had a circumference of about 16,000 yards. The trails to new airstrip sites had to be cleared, and General Turnage assigned this task to the 21st Marine Regiment. A Japanese ambush in the area resulted resulted in the 13-14 November Battle of the Coconut Grove, which ended with the Marines gaining control of the point where the Numma and east-west trails crossed. Throughout early November, the Japanese carried out air raids against the U.S. forces around Torokina. However, by the 17th of November, losses were such that the Japanese 1st Carrier Division, which had begun with 370 planes on the 1st of November, was withdrawn back to Truk. The U.S. forces were thereby able to gradually expand the perimeter out to 8 to 10 kilometers, eventually capturing 2 airfields with which they could subsequently launch their own attacks against Rabaul. Following this, the Japanese troops on Bougainville essentially became isolated. Late November at Rabaul, General Imamura was still convinced that the Allies did not mean to stay long at Torokina. He was sure it was just a stepping stone. He had no interest in mounting a decisive counterattack on the Allied beachhead using the substantial number of troops he already had in the southern part of Bougainville. Instead, he reinforced the Buka Island area, just off the north coast of the larger island, believing it to be the Allies' real target. Thus, the Army repeated the era of Guadalcanal, while the Navy could not convince Imamura of the Americans' real intentions. The 18-25 November Battle of Piva Forks effectively wiped out an entire Japanese infantry regiment. Even so, the beachhead was still not an entirely safe place. The day after the end of the Piva Forks action, as the 6th echelon of the invasion force was unloading at the beachhead, Japanese artillery fired on the landing ships, inflicting casualties. The Marines silenced these guns the following day. On the 25th of November, as the Battle of Piva Forks was ending, the Battle of Cape St. George took place in the waters between Buka and New Ireland. 3 destroyer transports full of troops, escorted by 2 destroyers, all under the command of Captain Kyoto Kagawa, were on the way to reinforce Buka. Admiral Halsey directed 5 destroyers under Captain Ali Burke to intercept. The encounter ended with the sinking of Onami, Makanami and Yugumo, as well as the death of Captain Kagawa. No hits were scored on Burke's vessels. The battle was not completely one-sided, though. On 28-29 November, in an effort to block reinforcements from the Japanese 23rd Infantry Regiment, the 1st Marine Parachute Battalion was carried out a raid on Koiari, about 15 kilometers from Torokina. After landing unopposed, the Japanese counterattacked heavily and the Marines, facing being overrun, had to be rescued by a landing craft, which took 3 attempts to get ashore. December 1943, securing the perimeter, under extremely difficult conditions. The naval construction battalions and a group of New Zealand engineers carried out work on the 3 airstrips. The fighter strip at the beach was the first to begin full-time operations, with the first flights taking place on the 10th of December. The Japanese Army commander at Rabaul was certain that the Allies would be moving on from Torokina. Imamura ordered a build-up of the defences at Buin, on the southern tip of Bougainville. In November and December, the Japanese emplaced field artillery on the high ground around the beachhead, concentrated in a group of hills along the Torokina River overlooking the eastern perimeter. They shelled the beachhead, targeting the airstrips and the supply dumps. The 3rd Marine Division extended its lines to include the hills in a series of operations that lasted from 9 to 27 December. One hill, dubbed Hellzapoppin Ridge, was a natural fortress, overlooking the beachhead. It was 300 feet long, with steep slopes on a narrow crest. The Japanese constructed extensive positions on the reverse slopes using natural and artificial camouflage. The 21st Marines attacked Hellzapoppin Ridge but were driven off on the 12th of December. Several airstrikes missed the narrow ridge completely. Finally, coordinated air, artillery, and infantry attacks resulted in the capture of the ridge on the 18th of December. In the days that followed, the 21st Marines were also involved in fighting around Hill 600A, which was captured by the 24th of December 1943. On the 15th of December, the 1st Marine Amphibious Corps and General Geiger were replaced by the U.S. Army's 14th Corps, led by Major General Oscar W. Griswold, the victor of the land campaign on New Georgia. On the 28th of December, the 3rd Marine Division, exhausted because most of the fighting had taken place in its sector, was replaced by the Army's Americal Division under Major General John R. Hodge. The 37th Division, left behind at Torokina when the Marines pulled out, was then placed under Griswold's 14th Corps. January to February 1944, encircling Rabaul. The aerial reduction of Rabaul. Rabaul had already been raided multiple times between the 12th of October and the 2nd of November by the heavy bombers of General George C. Kenny's Allied Air Force's Southwest Pacific area. Significant damage was done to ground installations, although the Japanese adapted by moving aircraft facilities underground. Only low-flying techniques such as dive bombing and glide bombing could achieve the accuracy required to pinpoint these installations, as well as neutralizing anti-aircraft weapons on attacking vessels in the harbor. To achieve this, the Allies began constructing several airstrips on Bougainville that would allow them to use the smaller, more maneuverable aircraft against Rabaul. The fighter strip on the beach at Torokina began operations on the 10th of December, while the inland bomber strip Beaver Uncle followed on Christmas Day, and the inland fighter strip Beaver Yoke on the 22nd of January. General Ralph J. Mitchell, USMC, took over the command of all land-based planes in the theater, called Air Command Solomons, on the 20th of November. Once the three airstrips in the Torokina perimeter became fully functional, Mitchell moved Air Sol's headquarters from Munda on New Georgia Island. The first raids by Air Sol's aircraft had limited success. Japanese anti-aircraft fire, especially from ships, had improved greatly since Kenny's raids, and inflicted significant damage on the raiders. Gradually, however, the Americans developed new formations and tactics that brought about increasing attrition among the Japanese fighter arm. The Navy could no longer risk exposing its ships to the relentless air attacks, and by late January, Admiral Kusaka had banned all shipping except barges from Simpson Harbor, which removed any remaining naval threat to the Torokina beachhead. By mid-February, when the Allies captured the Green Islands, the Japanese base was no longer able to project air power to interfere. For the 8th of March, while the battle for the perimeter was beginning on Bougainville, Air Solomon's bombers began flying unescorted to Rabaul. In describing the effect, Morrison writes, "It is significant that the splendid harbor, which in October 1943 had held some 300,000 tons of enemy shipping, and had sheltered powerful task forces of the Japanese Navy, was reduced to a third-rate barge depot." Capture of the Green Islands. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had determined that Rabaul was to be encircled, with invasions of the Admiralty Islands and Cavien on the north tip of the island of New Ireland to begin the 1st of April at the earliest. Admiral Halsey, anxious to maintain offensive momentum, was unwilling to leave his forces idle until then. To that end, and to provide yet another airfield close to Rabaul, Halsey ordered his amphibious forces to invade the Green Islands, a group of small coral atolls about 115 miles east of Rabaul. Reconnaissance missions determined that the native Melanesians were well disposed toward the Europeans, and had been alienated by the Japanese. As a result, Allied planners determined that no preliminary bombing or shelling would be carried out. On February 15, Admiral Wilkinson landed a contingent of New Zealanders from the 3rd Division under Major General Harold E. Barrowclough. Experience gained from previous landings, coupled with detailed staff work, meant that the landings were completed with relative efficiency. In addition, interference from Japanese planes was minimal. Morrison attributed this to previous losses inflicted against the Japanese air arm, writing that the fact such a large fleet could set thousands of troops ashore with impunity only 115 miles from Rabaul proved what good work air solos had already accomplished. The Greens provided a site for a PT boat base, and during the night of the 1st of March, PT 319 entered Simpson Harbor, and went undetected by the Japanese. This would have been inconceivable just 2 months earlier. In addition, a detachment of Seabees constructed and airfield putting the Japanese base at Kavieng in range of air solos planes for the first time.